So we would love for each panel member just to really briefly just tell us a little bit about yourself and your work, like real short, so we can jump right in. And Elizabeth, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, I'm more than happy to. Thanks for having me here. I'm Elizabeth Wangeshi Shege. I'm a board member at the World Green Building Council and also the chair of the Africa Regional Network of the World Green Building Council. I work for sustainable energy for all as an energy efficient and cooling specialist.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sheila, you're the face I see. Please tell us a little bit about your work.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sheila Patel. I live in Mumbai. I'm part of a global social movement of poor people living informally in 33 countries called Shack Dwellers International. We work on issues of bringing cities to work on issues of informality, both in the development and climate space. I'm also an ambassador for the Race to Resilience as part of the preparation for non-state actors to be part of COP. And I'm here to look at how informality can jump into these discussions on climate resilience.
Okay, great. Magali, tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
Yes, thank you and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Magali Anderson. I'm the Chief Sustainability and Innovation Officer at Holcim. Holcim is the biggest cement and concrete maker in the world. And our mission is really to look at how we can decarbonize industry, but also looking at how we can build more resilient cities with lower CO2, looking at both mitigation and adaptation of climate change.
Great, and I think you win the best background. I like the pillow and the white. It looks awesome. Is Radhika on? Do we have our other panelist? I don't see her. Okay, fine. Well, let's start. Magali, I learned a little bit in some of my discussions with you that your company is developing low carbon materials that will really help reduce the carbon footprint of new construction. But there isn't like an enormous demand yet for some of these materials. Tell us a little bit about the technology and then some of the things you're observing about the demand and how we maybe could increase the demand so more people know about this.
Yeah, it's quite interesting because we already know how to produce cement that is minimum 30% lower CO2 than what you would find in a normal country. And it goes all the way to 70%. We do that by replacing the fossil fuel that is used to heat up the kiln by waste and biomass, but also by putting byproduct from other industries to replace some of the clinker, which is what makes the cement. So that's those levers, we understand them very well. And we launched about 2 years ago a product called Pact, which is a low carbon concrete. It's now been in 24 markets all across the world. And what's interesting is when we launched it, everyone told us there is no demand. Why do you launch a green product? It doesn't work. No one wants it. What we see 2 years later is we have reached more than 10% sales. In India last month, we were at 18% of our sales in low carbon concrete. So really, we can see some local appetite, but why not 100%? Because we could do right now way more than that if the demand existed. So the question is, how come the demand doesn't exist? Is it because people don't know about our product? Maybe. Is it because there's not enough incentive in terms of low carbon product? Is it because public procurement is not putting the type of requirement they need in the public tenders, et cetera, et cetera? There's so many things I could think of that could accelerate that, because as a cement maker, we are ready to completely inundate the market with our low carbon products if the demand existed.
Okay, I want to turn to some of the other panelists, but first, I've always wondered, what is the difference between cement and concrete? I'm sorry.
Okay, so the best explanation I ever got, I love to share, is think of the flour, the flour that you use in the bakery. It's complicated to make, right? So that's the cement. The flour is complicated to make and you don't eat it. Then after you mix that flour with a lot of other things and you make a cake, and that's what you eat. So the concrete is what you use. The cement is a complicated thing that you use to make the concrete.
Okay, fine.
Brilliant.
That's good. Okay, Sheila, you know a lot about how poor communities are constructing their homes. And you had told me that the materials they use, like a large percentage is recycled materials. They're not going into a hardware store or a Home Depot equivalent and buying stuff off the shelf. Tell us a little bit about the new construction in some cities and how we might be able to make that greener and a lower carbon footprint from the way people build today.
So it's important to first of all acknowledge that most people who live informally start off by being illegal, constantly having their homes demolished. And therefore their building design and construction systems are ones where you can dismantle the house and run away with it. Gradually, they get more security. As they earn more money, they start replacing their floors, their walls, and their roof with recycled material. And their aspiration is to have a brick and cement concrete house, which they can rarely afford. And in most instances, it's usually the second or the fourth generation that does that. So if you take what we are doing right now, is we're trying to help communities incrementally upgrade their homes in ways that they can do within the financial framework of affordability that they have. And very often the materials they choose is either overspecified or doesn't need to be so many steel rods or so much cement. But when they do take formal materials, they are trying to copy what I call the overcompensation, which is not good for housing. And so what we are looking for is an incremental mechanism, because most poor people in Asia and Africa design, finance, and construct their own homes. And most formal institutional arrangements, and like Magali said, the procurement processes are all very old-fashioned and they need to change. And we need to popularize both for those who are poor, resilient housing that is within their financial capacities, and assist cities to put in good quality infrastructure so that people, when they upgrade their homes, the mix works for them in the long run. That's not happening at all right now.
Now, Sheila, can I just follow up? How would you get poor people who are informal or constructing informal settlements to use lower carbon, higher tech materials that are becoming available? How would you bring that to them or introduce them to them?
So far what we are doing for that is with some initial grant money, we work with architects and construction material providers to design what we call a model house. In most cases, people don't believe that is strong. So we have a very interesting example of funicular roofing material that people can build themselves that costs 1/4 of a RCC cement roof, which is what is their imagery of a strong roof. And very often in every city, we have women who design and build this. We put it up in the house and we make 20 men jump up and down on it to make them believe that it's strong enough. And once that happens, it multiplies. So the material has to be available, the financing has to be available, and the mechanisms by which people can build this. And so now we have at least 7 countries in which this kind of roofing is available. But so far it was done with the traditional cement. It'll be interesting to do it with the new material that Magali is talking about.
Okay. We have Radhika. We'll turn to you in a second, Radhika, and thanks. It's good to have you looming over us. Elizabeth, tell us about, in Africa, the African Union is trying to kind of come up with some universal standards and an ambitious manifesto to tackle some of this. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So as part of the regional network for the Wild Green Building Council, our 3 main causes are advocacy, education, as well as certification, because what's low carbon, what's green? So we had to demystify that. And beyond that, we realized a lot of the policies are actually setting us back, because by the time the policy is written, it's outdated, it's not linked to the climatic effects. So the regional network has actually put 12 countries together, and the manifesto itself had to take the conversation back to basics. Because we can go forward talking about what we're going to do in the future, but we actually need to start now. And we realized even conversations around energy efficiency, which is a fast fuel, is not being considered. So the manifesto itself broke down the work towards five priority areas. So that's energy, water, materials that we've been discussing. Finance has been mentioned, and also infrastructure. So Africa itself is building infrastructure now. We're building our cities now. A quarter of the future cities will be in Africa. And that's part of the reason we have these informal settlements that are being referred to, is because we haven't planned for them. So there's a high urbanization rate, and people end up living in these informal settlements. But we don't recognize that these people also have some form of finance. So a lot of the banks will exclude them, and they end up having to build, as has been mentioned before, but there's opportunity for a lot of affordable housing. So, for example, Kenya itself put affordable housing as one of the major deliverables for the government, and the target was to build 500,000 homes. Within 3-4 years, we're nowhere near that. I think the last number was about 60,000. So with that deficit of housing, the conversation around construction and low carbon construction is not an option. It's not a matter of there should be an option of materials. We do believe that the materials, all of them in the market, in the rural areas, should actually be low carbon. You shouldn't have to choose low carbon or not low carbon. But that's not just the physical materials. We're talking about cement. We don't actually use engineered timber enough. So there's a supply chain opportunity around that to introduce alternative materials. But it's across energy, water, and infrastructure as well.
And tell us a little bit about the banks, because that could be a pressure point. I mean, if we could bring the financing institutions to really embrace a greener approach and make that a condition for the loans, right? That could change a lot. So is anybody working on that?
Well, there's a few people working on it, and one of the reasons we made it a key point is every time we said build green, it was a matter of policy or finance. So the biggest change we've seen in Africa is when a financial body puts in the requirement that this should go to responsible investment, then we see the low carbon developments coming up. But the issue is that also 4% of the investments actually being done in Africa are actually for low carbon. Hence, we are where we are with the climatic effects. It shouldn't be 4%. It should be 100%. But we have left some people behind. We've left this financial sector behind in this conversation. Thankfully, we learned that using the SDG language can bring the conversation together. And also say, if we are targeting, for example, SDG 7, the financial sector should be part of the conversation. And hopefully between now and COP27, we do expect that Financial Day will actually bring out a lot more on the basis of any kind of investments coming into Africa should actually be for low carbon development.
And how seriously are the governments in Africa, like in Kenya, how seriously do they take these issues?
They do take the issues seriously. For example, Kenya is one of the leading countries around this climatic effects and ambition around it. So there's climate change acts and committees around it, and it's not just at the national level. It also goes down to the state level and on the ground level. But as you can imagine, transforming the national goals takes a long time. So it's not just about the government, it's about the people on the ground. And I do believe the message is in getting to the people on the ground. That's why, for example, you'll find the low carbon cement is not being used as much as it should be, but people don't know. Right. So we really rely on you as New York Times and
a lot of pressure.
Communications experts to move the conversation from technical conversation and actually see how we can both get it to the ground.
Okay. Radhika, tell us just quickly a little bit about yourself and your work, and then I'd love for you to weigh in on the built environment and sort of what you see as the condition of the existing infrastructure. Like, is it totally unhelpful to these goals? And would it make more sense, like in a carbon calculation, to tear it down and rebuild, or would that create like more pollution and CO2 than trying to modify what we have?
Thanks. So I'm an associate professor at the Smith School of Enterprise and Environment at the University of Oxford, and I also run the Oxford India Centre for Sustainable Development. Just taking a broader view, of the built environment, I think it's important to remember that buildings in 2019 were responsible for 21% of all greenhouse gas emissions. And if we look only at CO2, it was 31%. So almost a third of all CO2 emissions come from buildings. And this is a huge amount, right? But yet, when we look at the state of our built environment, none of the things about the level of emissions, about how energy intensive buildings are new. We've known these for decades at this point, and they've been key to all the IPCC reports. But yet, the status of the built environment as a place that can achieve carbon mitigation and adaptation has not been at the level of success that it needed to be. And, I think sort of recognizing that this is an area which has huge potential, but yet is complicated to address. And the fact that we've not been able to do that well enough is an important sort of starting point. And then you have to ask the question, why, right? Why hasn't this worked? And it is because this is a socio-technical system, it isn't one where you just have technologies that can be put in place. These technologies are integrated and embedded within much larger structures of formality, informality, finance, real estate developers, institutional capacity, quality of life for people and the aspirations that they have around wanting certain types of buildings, and then the ability to finance all of that has been complicated to be able to achieve. So I'd say that, coming back to your question about retrofitting versus new construction, this is where the developing world actually does have an opportunity in terms of being able to build in a manner that is compatible with climate change upfront, because what it does is it's going to prevent being locked into the types of really poor practices that most of the developed world is now stuck in as far as the built environment is concerned, right? And buildings actually are amongst the largest and the longest living components of the economy. It's actually not power plants, but buildings that's once they're built, they stay for hundreds of years. And so I would say that actually recognizing that crossroads that we're at, particularly in developing countries, and providing the finance and the capacities to be able to build that, build up those cities and spaces in a manner that is compatible with climate impacts is a key opportunity. And then for the developed world, it's actually much harder to do the retrofitting, but there is no way that our climate targets can be met unless we tackle this issue. So it is more expensive and it will require complicated changes. None of these are impossible to do, but it requires leadership and all actors being on board. And we know how to do it, but we're not getting there yet.
And where do you think, which new urban areas, because like you said, Africa and parts of the developing world, these cities are growing as we speak. They're not locked into the infrastructure the way the West has been. Which are the best, are there any positive examples that you can draw on where they're doing it right, doing it better?
So there are pockets of positive examples in most places. And I think it's really important to recognize those as well. Sort of in the city of Rajkot in India, where I used to work, there is actually really interesting affordable housing that is built that allows for natural ventilation, that allows for solar water heaters on top. And these are part of, these are all climate compatible building design elements that are part of construction. In other cities, there are heat action plans that can work or cannot work, but there is a kind of motivation to be able to address some of these impacts of extreme heat. I'm sure Sheila can talk of a number of different examples also in her work that she's doing with informal settlements. So yes, these examples exist. The point is, do they exist to scale? Okay,
and let me ask you, Elizabeth. Sure. Because I had lived in Nairobi. Nairobi is an absolutely beautiful place to be. It's also sunny, Like, is solar taking off? I mean, there's huge opportunities for solar energy in a place like that. So in informal settlements, or maybe the next step up, the emerging middle class, are people exploiting solar energy?
Well, one of the ways they are exploiting is solar hot water heaters, as mentioned. So there's a regulation that came out that every house that uses over 100 liters needs to have solar hot water. And the interesting thing about that is people did go back to court to say, look, we're not ready for this with the transition of existing buildings. But people started seeing the positive effects around it, the benefits around it. They saw their electricity bills coming down. So they're actually putting solar hot water heaters, whether regulation wants it or not. The other thing as well that delays in some aspects is there's net metering opportunity, but we need to have ESCOs, we need to have the supply chains, and unfortunately, we're importing about 80% of the building materials into Africa. We don't have that industrialization of making the materials locally. So there's carbon emissions with bringing in the solar panels, and one of the questions we ask is, what do we do with the solar panels after 25, 40 years? Are we creating another problem rather than thinking about decarbonization in the future, local resourcing, and recycling, etc.? So it's not one solution fits all. We're seeing positive aspects in one way or another, but in so many aspects, we're not there yet.
Sheila, India makes lots of solar panels. So you don't have that immediate drawback of bringing them in. They make them there, and the current government has made like that a real priority. Is it taking off?
Well, it's taking off, and yet it's not at volumes that are hugely impactful. And the reason for that is that solar panels, it's not just a matter of putting up solar panels. We've got at least 15 buildings that we ourselves as slum dwellers have constructed on which we have solar panels. In different, in different climatic conditions, they need cleaning, they need maintenance. And very often this is not part of the training and the establishing, of systems that is there. But one other thing which was mentioned by the earlier speaker is that the regulatory framework, as state electricity boards allow for dual electricity use, this becomes very critical, because if you take, for instance, in Mumbai, for 4 months of the year, we have monsoons. That time we cannot use the solar panel produced electricity. So this duality and the state administration utilizing this is very important. Talking about Kenya, I just want to go back to what was being said, because both of you were talking about Nairobi. Radhika talked about infrastructure planning. You know that almost no designing of infrastructure in informal settlements is taught in any educational institution that does planning. And so in Mukuru, which is one of the largest industrial slums in Nairobi, the government of Nairobi and the local federation of, which is a member of ours, has developed new norms, new standards, new ways of using community participation to develop roads, infrastructure, markets in informal settlements that will allow the state to make those investments while people will start examining ways to do new forms of housing. And now we're looking at ways by which we can work with educational institutions to institutionalize this form of learning, because most of our town planners and illustrious planning institutions in India are still following northern and western forms of planning, which are not good for slums. They don't help slums. So I think we have a long list of things to do in order to produce something that is holistic and citywide. We're not there yet. And the sad news is we're not investing in making these kind of holistic alternatives that are robust and that can multiply.
If I may add to that, one of the issues we're seeing, and it's quite similar with the planning and the conversation around how we're building our cities and infrastructure, is that we haven't taken a step back to do forecasting, scientific forecasting. So we might be putting people in danger while we think we're actually building the low carbon buildings. We really need to overlap the climatic effects and look at the forecast of 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, what's happening with climate change, because we're working with obsolete science, yet there's the science that's there that's available. So some of the work that SE for All is actually doing and looking at is forecasting, overlapping the growth of the cities and also overlapping population increase, as well as the climatic effects, to actually say, we might be helping this slum or informal settlement here, but it should be somewhere else, because in 5 years' time, they'll be flooded. And actually that's happening in a lot of areas where, and even here in the UK, where you have, every time there's cold weather, there's flooding, people refurbish, they move back in, it happens again. So we're wasting resources in that sense, that we're not using science. And it's something that in Africa we really need to look at. We already know what the climatic effects are, but link that now to the planning and use of materials, etc., but putting people in the center of it. Because if we put technology in the center of our solutions to climate change, then we're losing the whole plot, really. And we're doing exactly what we've been doing over the last 50 years and expecting a different solution. So if we put people in the center and we say, culturally, this is how these people live, these are the areas they live in, what is science happening around climate change, then now we collaborate around it.
No, that's a really interesting point, and it's like a shifting target. I mean, you don't want to build a whole community in a place that's going to be unlivable in 10 or 20 years, right? Exactly. What do you guys think? We've written a little bit at the New York Times about the social justice issues of urban environments and how poorer neighborhoods have fewer trees, they have less shade, the people are exposed to extreme heat more. This is going to become more and more of an issue, and there's more awareness of it, I think. Like, we're writing about it for the first time. These neighborhoods have always, been devoid of big leafy trees, and it's only now in, 2022 that we're focusing on it. What can we do about those gaps?
I can jump in before. I think there's a hand in there. Just very quickly
Gotta
mention.
hit the buzzer fast.
Mention that one of the studies that was done by SE for All, it showed that 1.2 billion people are at risk from extreme heat, and it's because of exactly that. We're removing the natural ways of actually working with cooling solutions. So most of the global north or developed countries will plug in an air conditioner or a fan with these rising temperatures. But when we talk about this informal settlements, they don't even afford a fan, let alone access to electricity. So we start looking at, we don't have electricity for these people, there's heat level rise, and then we talk about the pandemic. We couldn't even cool the vaccines. So there's an issue with that, but beyond that, when you talk about people at the center of this, there's a food element. We lose a lot of 60 to 70% of the food is perishable, and it doesn't even get to the cities. So we've seen that this conversation around cooling is the next big thing, and I think Radhika can actually come in to that as well. Thank you.
Radhika?
Yeah, thanks.
Please.
So, we have a large program on the future of cooling, and I'm really glad that this topic has come up. So there are a few things to say. One is like we just heard, I mean, the rise of cooling is, it's kind of been a blind spot in our sustainability debate. So the IEA number is that we will be using an equivalent of 10 new air conditioners every second for the next 30 years. So that is it's an extraordinary amount of increase, and these are all new air conditioners that are going to be bought by people. What is really interesting about that is that in spite of that large increase, the number of people who will not have access to cooling is between 4 to 6 billion people by 2050. So the equity and the justice issue around cooling is extraordinary, both in terms of the increase in air conditioning and the number of people who will not have it because of the rise in extreme heat. Now, we also know that of all the climate change extreme weather events, extreme heat kills the most. And it is a silent killer in a way, like you don't see the devastation of infrastructure, right? It's actually just human beings who are not able to survive at that level. And, you know, cooling is also interesting from a sustainability point of view, because if we look at all the different 17 sustainable development goals and their sort of hundreds of targets, there is not once the mention of the word cooling, fridge, refrigeration. Cooling does not exist within the gamut of the sustainable development goals. So it's really been a blind spot, but one that we can't ignore. And for air conditioning to be the sort of primary solution to it, which is what we're seeing in the developed and the developing world, is really problematic, because air conditioning actually has its own negative feedback loop. The more you use air conditioning, the warmer the city gets, because it leads to an urban heat island effect. And then the more it also releases greenhouse gases, that again further contributes to global warming. And then we have more increased weather events, increased heat waves that require more air conditioning. So it's really a vicious cycle that we need to break. And again, like, the means to break it do exist. It's just that this has not been embedded in our planning processes or in our aspirations and lifestyles around how to react to this extreme heat that is upon us.
Magali, I'm sorry, we haven't. Yeah. No. We've been caught up in this other stuff. Tell us, like, is there anything on the material side or that you guys are working on to deal with cooling?
It's plenty things, and that's why I was going to raise my hand to jump in right there, because we're not going to solve the problem of extreme heat. That obviously the material will not solve that. But what we can do, though, is reduce the impact of what we call urban heat island effect. So if you take two streets of a city, one with trees, one without trees, at midday on a summer day, you can have a difference between 5 and 10 degrees Celsius. I mean, that's enormous. But it's not just the difference at the street level, it's also the difference within the house, how much you need to cool the house. And so the type of product that exists today, we have a concrete ourselves called hydromedia, which is kind of porous. And what it means is we can literally plant trees into it. So you don't have to choose anymore between having a muddy pathway with trees or having concrete and no trees. You can actually find the middle ground, which you need in urban areas. And this is actually, because it's porous, it absorbs up to 600 liters per square meter per second. So in heavy rainy environment, obviously, if you're in Paris just above the subway, the water would don't know where to go, but in other type of environment, you can evacuate the water much faster. But we also have green roofs. We are working on vertical forest as well, true vertical forest. So I think going back to the nature, which is what beats the heat the best, and going back to how do we reconcile that urbanization trend with nature? How do we make cities where nature is included into it? And that's why I love that discussion about let's build in the global south differently than how we have been building in the global north, learning from the mistakes. And fighting the urban heat island effect should be at the top of every urban planning development. And we have the products today that exist to beat it. Not to beat it, but to diminish the effect.
That's great. Okay, can we go to questions? We have like 10 minutes left. And I appreciate everything everybody's been saying so far. Sure.
I'm very excited to be first. I have to talk to you, Magali. I'm on the board of a company called Planet Smart City, which builds affordable housing in emerging markets and tries to do so in environmentally friendly ways. And we are looking for a provider of materials that can supply us cost effectively with low carbon cement and steel. My question to you, apart from what is your contact details, is what do we do about the green premium? We're trying to build affordable housing. Some of the people who are buying the things that we produce can't afford another $5 a month. From what I've read, green steel is 40% more expensive than garden variety, and cement 200% as expensive. That's what I like to see. Yeah, how do we manage to balance the desire to supply high-quality housing to low-income people and do so cost-effectively?
So on the answer for my private details, you find them on LinkedIn very easily. I'm super easy. But to answer your question, which is a true question, I think today green products, if they were so expensive, we wouldn't be representing 20% of our concrete sales in India. So I won't say there's no premium, but it's very limited. So we work a lot in Holcim in affordable houses. We work a lot in several ways. One is on the technology side. So for example, last year we built a 3D printed school in Malawi. And we did that. We could print the walls of the school in 18 hours. I think there's a gap of 40,000 schools in Malawi, so we could really bridge that gap very quickly. And we actually make the ink locally, the ink being the concrete. And we have just launched a project. We've been talking about Kenya, so it's my turn to talk about Kenya. We've just launched a project of 52 affordable houses in Kenya, 3D printed. We are looking at a target. I can't actually give the number here, but we are looking at a target quite low. And we partner in Mexico. We've been partnering with Habitat for Humanity, and we partner with an organization, it's a startup called iBuilt, to look at how we put together financial helps and microcredit to the people who do that. The affordable houses we do in Africa, actually, we have claimed CO2 credit because of the lower CO2, and we use those CO2 credit to lower the price of the house. We don't use it to put it in our pocket. We use it to put it so there's many initiatives that, at least at Holcim, I can't talk for the entire sectors, that we are conducting in several countries, including bringing technology that people were telling us why do you bring 3D printing? But in what we saw in Malawi, where we did the first test, is we put about half less concrete for the same strengths. So the overall CO2 in cement is much lower than being built with the traditional material, much quicker. So there's many things we can do there if we all partners. That's why I mentioned some partnership, if we all partners to do it together.
Hi, sorry, you're not off the hook yet. I have one more question. Just out of curiosity, the materials that you're developing, is there any exploration or research into the thermal capacitance or the heat loss coefficient of the material? Because with the right materials, these buildings could really act as a battery, especially with the increased amount of cooling that's going to be done. If we could optimize how they keep cooled air or heated air, depending on the climate, these could really combat some of the peak demand issues that will rise with the rise of cooling units. So I was just curious if that was a metric that you guys were looking at when developing this material.
I guess that's for me again. And yes, we do. We have a building in Austria, so it's not in the south, but it's Austria, which retains the heat and allows to be heated for less than $2 per year because of how the cement used as a battery. You are right, the cement actually, or the concrete, has a thermal mass, which is make it absolutely great to do that. In Algeria, we have been doing with foam cement some roofs that are completely insulating against the heat. So there's many initiatives. Concrete is a fantastic material in terms of thermal mass that allows this type of things. It's still pretty early. It has not been deployed at scale, but extremely promising.
Hi, Chavi Mago. I'm a sustainability strategy manager with Accenture, our sustainability practice in London. Just wanted to thank all the speakers. Really insightful event and panel discussion. Cities are such an important focus as we transition towards the SDGs and make progress on that. I have a question for Magali again. So you mentioned the challenges that you faced around developing products where there wasn't currently demand. And this is something that we're hearing across other hard-to-abate sectors as well. So very keen to understand any learnings that you may have from that process, any motivators for businesses that can be then kind of applied to other sectors as well.
Just be bold. No, seriously, that's what we dealt with. Okay, we are a big company, so obviously we can do it. A smaller company might struggle because the risk are quite high. But, you know, at one stage we said we have to stop with the chicken and egg story. There's no demand because the product is not there. So people demand what exists. So if we wait for demand to see the real signal, it will never happen. So we just went out and deployed it. Like the first year in more than 15 countries, we went ahead, deployed it, made a strong marketing around it, and it worked. So be bold, just do it.
Brilliant.
Yeah. Hello, this is Rafael from Atmos Lab, an environmental consultancy working in the building industry. We've heard a lot about building new buildings, but in developed countries like the UK, 70 to 80% of the buildings standing by 2050 have already been built. So I would like to hear a little bit of the thought of the panel about how we're going to decarbonize these existing buildings and what are the main challenges that we face.
Radhika, maybe you'd be the best to tackle that.
Yeah, I can have a go. So, you know, if we look, I mean, the UK building stock is amongst the worst building stock in the world. So, just, you know, that's our starting point here. But what we have to do is then break down where are the biggest sources of consumption within that stock, right? And for the UK, heating is actually a really, really key component of that. And so as you might have come across, like there's a shift now towards moving away from gas boilers to heat pumps. And heat pumps are actually quite interesting because it's just an air conditioner in reverse. So you could actually use it for both things. But and there are incentives around, you know, providing heat pumps, but again, not available to scale, and they've not really taken off. But that is going to be a key component for the UK housing stock. The second is actually around insulation, right? So basically, what are the things we can do without like tearing the whole place down? So an insulation of building, of windows, of roofs, potentially even of walls is again really important. I mean, it's amazing how just by using different types of materials, you can have dramatic changes in the performance of a building. So I would say, you know, those two things. And then the third would be, of course, using solar, being able to, you know, become a prosumer in the economy. So not just a consumer, but one that is actually producing electricity and feeding it back to the grid, and being able to manage your building operations on renewable energy sources. And I think if, you know, that's definitely a starting point for the UK. The UK does have a building strategy that the government has put out. Interestingly, actually, cooling is not really considered in that strategy. And, you know, I mean, cooling is not the primary issue for the UK, but it is getting really hot. And therefore, like having a more integrated approach would be helpful.
Please.
So that's just brilliant because you just hit on my area of research. I'm Pippa Palmer from this London South Bank University School of the Built Environment and Architecture, and retrofit is my area of, or systems change for the built environment, but retrofit is my specific area of interest and research. And leading on from the last question around what materials we can innovate, and then looking at retrofit and the particular problem, we're in pilot stage. Somebody described it to me on Friday as an emerging megatrend. Retrofit is and I thought, for the first time in years, I thought, oh, I'm not just really dull at parties, I'm actually ahead of the curve. But the problem we've got the money being pumped in, we've got funding coming in from government in dribs and drabs, but for social housing, we've got many segments of the market that just are not accelerating. Even with these pilots, when we get there, we've got to do this at scale, 9 times the amount. And these materials you're talking about are really wonderful. But what's the biggest mechanism we can use to get these adopted at scale rather than being small pilots that are hopeful and wonderful, but how do we make that big switch so these materials and building practices and retrofit are adopted at scale?
I think we're just about out of time, but do you guys want to just have a quick response to that?
I can jump in?
Please.
Sure. So as much as people are talking about this as a solution for the global north, there's existing cities in Africa and the Middle East. And actually, there's a whole pathway that has been drafted for the Middle East, noting all the wars that have been there, the infrastructure that's been decimated one way or another. So there are solutions, but one thing that's missing is policy. So you shouldn't have an option. We all know that climate change is happening now. It shouldn't be an option of do a little bit of this. The time for small incremental change is gone. So the other opportunity we have is skills. Where are we getting the skills to actually refurbish these buildings or the built environment? The focus was more on new development, and we forgot our trades as well. And it's not just in the global north, it's global south as well. Luckily, we have over 70% of the population as youth. So there's an opportunity to look at a macro scale, skill development in the built environment. And lastly, human behavior. We know that there's a climatic change, there's climatic effects. Then we want to rebuild and say we're green and then carry on doing what we've been doing over the last 50 or so years and then get another critical crisis and then deal with that. So there's all these aspects that we need to consider and the social sciences around it. One of my last points, I just wanted to mention that when we mention traditional materials, it's quite on the basis of perception. So traditional materials in Africa were quite green. They were local materials. It was what people could find, and they would use that. And they were very good for passive design elements. We've forgotten how to build to climate. We want to have the best technology, copy what's happening in New York, copy what's happening in another city. But now we need to go back to basics and look at passive design solutions, traditional, not on the essence of industrialized materials, but where we started from. There's fantastic buildings in global north as well. And lastly, I'd like to say energy efficiency. We tend to forget that the fast fuel that we can save is the one we have. Thanks for that.
No, that's great. I think we have one more question, please.
For the people that live in Africa in the villages, like they have to keep moving because of floods. And the people here in London, we just stay. Like, how could people that own industries in the future help with that?
That's a very good question. And it's one of the things I keep saying, that we're building in the wrong places. We need to know where we should be building in the future, rather than allowing people to settle in climatic crisis paths. I've seen that people have moved here as well. There was a flood in Germany the other day, and people had to move, and some people are not moving back. So we're creating climate refugees. So we need to really consider that as well in our planning, and how we support them financially and in humanitarian ways. People think it's just Africa that's facing the humanitarian issues, but also in this region. Thank you for that question.
Guys, that was a great panel. I mean, there's so many, it's like so complicated, but it's encouraging like how much knowledge just with our small group is out there. I'd like to thank everybody for attending, and at that we're just gonna call it closed, and thank you.